I guess I just sort of start by saying, crypto, I guess, whatever the right term is sort of having a moment. It's becoming much more mainstream. There's a statistic that 28% of American adults now have some crypto holdings. So we're here really to talk about sort of what are the risks to that and how do we mitigate those risks. And I think leaving aside just the issue of the blockchain technology itself, which I think we know creates a immutable record and has essentially sort of security built into its architecture. But there are other places where it's vulnerable, and even that architecture has some questions, as I think we're going to raise. But let me start with you, Chris, because you've obviously looked at security broadly across all sorts of industries, and some of them are certainly not unique to blockchain and to DeFi. Can you talk through where we stand just in terms of security risks, not just in America but around the world?
Sure. Yeah. So it's a tremendous challenge. In fact, obviously, we just released our 2025 data breach investigations report, and you saw a lot of the stats there pop up on the screen as we walked out. And I think one of the interesting things was just the doubling, for example, of third-party risk from 15% to 30%. The fact that most organizations today rely on probably not just one, but maybe a dozen, or depending on the size of the organization, maybe even hundreds of third parties. If you add in things like their suppliers and vendors, it becomes a much more complex ecosystem. And what we find is that introduces another level of risk that a lot of organizations just haven't fully cared for. And this is obviously a global problem because even if you're a largely, say, US-centric organization, there's a really good chance that your partners, suppliers, or vendors may be elsewhere, which may mean access to your systems are happening from elsewhere, or access to your data is happening elsewhere.
Konstantin, and in the DeFi world, in the crypto world, the payouts are just so much bigger, which makes the risks so much higher. And could you talk a little bit about the different kinds of risks that you're seeing as people try to access those wallets or those systems?
Yeah, for sure. First off, maybe as a primer, and you've mentioned it, what's interesting is that crypto is an acceptable word again. I remember the last 4 years we were always digital assets, and obviously now we're back at crypto, which is great. I think the Blockdaemon runs is the largest infrastructure operator in crypto, and we also have technology for wallets. We sell technology to 70% of the largest institutions in the world, and so we see a lot of this. And crypto, obviously, when you talk about risk for security, there's different components, right? So a big one, actually, interestingly enough, in the crypto world, we're very used to risk in the sense of people try to steal from us all the time. Because, if you hack a wallet and there's digital assets in there, you can send them somewhere and great, off you are. And so I think crypto companies, luckily, we're very stress tested for sort of software ransomware type of attacks. Those are normally angles that we can prepare ourselves for. The angles that are much harder are the ones where it's actually not an AI, but a physical person. And so like we were referring it to earlier, like one of the problems we see is that engineers will apply for jobs, and there might be North Korean sleeper agents, and they're in your company for 2-3 years, and ultimately build something in your systems that then gets exploited, which was Bybit, for example. Looks like that's what happened there, which is a $1.5 billion drain on a wallet, and that's a good heist, And so the incentives for a long-term strategy here are very high, and it's very hard to, in a remote world where open source software gets developed by communities of people, to kind of filter out the who are really the people that are building code for good, and who are the ones that are more tricky. And the same is true for like personal safety. Obviously, the other one is the easiest part is you just snag someone you think looks like a crypto guy, and clobber them until they give you a ledger or whatever code it is you think that
the easiest way to crack a password is with a hammer to somebody's head.
Yeah, and it's interesting because for most of specifically the cold wallets, there aren't transfer limits, right? Like when you go to an ATM, there's like, you can get $2,000 every time or something. You can only clobber someone that often. But with a crypto wallet, it can be $100 million, right? And so it's very worth it. And so it's even more important than ever to be anonymous, and which is also part of the spirit of crypto. And so most people, I think, that I know that are important in crypto, you will never have heard of because they try to keep a very low profile. And so that's an important part of security as well, as like we don't talk about really what we do and who we are and who we service. We try to have as little profile as possible publicly.
But let me just come back to that North Korean sleeper agent, which is a real thing. That is not, in some sense, a traditional, cybersecurity issue. I mean, I'm not sure, Chris, if you have a solution to that, but how do you deal with issues like that? How do you know someone is somebody, and and is that really part of certainly your business, or how do you help companies deal with those sorts of things?
So I mean, we've seen a lot of those circumstances. I was sharing an example with you earlier that the first time we saw one of those come up was a couple of years ago, and the people who had encountered that sleeper agent kind of situation, they called in and said, "Hey, we need help investigating something, but I don't even know how to describe it. It seems like we hired someone, but we're not sure who they are." And then as we got to the crux of it, we figured out what had happened. But ultimately, obviously, it comes down to how robust you do things like background checks. But then also, people can get past that. There's fraudulent identities, stolen identities. So then the next thing that we're typically looking at is you're looking at user behavior. You're looking to see, is the person accessing your environment from where you expect them to? In this case, if they're coming from somewhere that's a sanctioned country, generally that's going to set off alarm bells in your systems. They may be wise and try to circumvent that. We work with a lot of organizations to help assess what are their security controls to see if they're robust enough to be able to capture that, as well as also things like managed services to say, look, if they don't have the skill set, the resources, or the technology in-house, then how do we help them augment what they have so they get that level of visibility so they can be comfortable that they're operating in a more secure manner?
And Konstantin, how did you deal with those situations?
I mean, in our case, luckily, we're pretty well trained to identify those things, and so we were able to. We had a North Korean asset apply for a job once, and we found out, and they were based in South Korea, and so it's not like it wasn't that obvious. It took us a minute, and we found out later that the person didn't make it through our interview process, but worked for another company and got outed, basically, and so that can happen, and actually, quite frankly. Similarly, and just to give it a more, I don't know if it's a fun thing, but, honeypotting also starts to happen a lot with apps like Telegram and WhatsApp and stuff, where individuals will be, and unfortunately mostly men, because men tend to be very susceptible to this thing, where somebody's like, hey, I read your profile, you sound really smart, can we talk? And people start building these relationships online. And there was actually a great economist series called Scamming that talks about that phenomena. And so I think those kind of things are also going to be really, really interesting. And so you really have to train your staff about, like, when something's too good to be true, it probably is. Like, really be careful who you share information with, any information, really. And so the other thing is that we see all the time is that people will get phone calls or text messages that look like they're from me, asking them to do things like wire things somewhere, or and so but they're getting very sophisticated. So early on, it was just a text message from a different number, right? We're just like, okay, well, easy, right? But on the messaging apps, it looks like it's my Telegram account, for example, messaging you, telling you to do something, and then it gets a little more, is this real or not? And then the next thing is that now they have AI voice agents, so you get all these robocalls all the time, and so they can actually give you a call and they'll sound like I'm talking. And so then it gets really hard. And so I don't even know where this ends, quite frankly. I'm not even sure about Chris here. No, but
I'm real.
Yeah. But it's an interesting conundrum that you just have to continue to train your staff at, right? And really remind people that identity theft is going to be really, really easy, and it's getting more and more sophisticated.
I mean, the good news is at Semafor, all we get is people asking us to buy gift cards for Justin Smith. So yeah, the risk is fairly low there.
But and I'll add another twist to that too that we've seen. So there's the element of the sleeper agents getting a job with your organization, but the other twist that we also see on that is they will pretend to be with an organization and they will try to lure your employees and say, look, I've got a great job. I think you're a perfect fit for it. They'll kind of know what the average salary is, and they'll say, look, I'll add another $100,000 to that. So it becomes really attractive to luring some of your people away. And whether they get the job or not, usually what they're trying to do is get information out of the interview process. So tell me, how familiar are you with this kind of technology? How do you do security? Give me an example. Give me a use case of something you've done. A lot of people are very excited to show off their skills. Will reveal more information than they should, which may be all the threat actor actually needs.
Let me pivot away from, I mean, this is the stuff of movies, and I'm sure there'll be a good TV series. Let me just pivot away to slightly, I'm not sure it's esoteric, but more infrastructure based. So constantly we're talking about sort of what the structural risks are to DeFi in terms of, how much concentration of power there might be, where the nodes sit, and so on. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. There's this inherent conundrum with crypto, which is basically there's a degree of cyber anarchism involved in the structure of these networks. So ideally, no participant in the network is supposed to be more powerful than the other, right? And so the whole authenticity and functionality of these networks lives by no individual having the control or group of people being able to turn a network off or change the rules without a really complex process. And so what happens now is one is when that changes and voting rights get implicated in more systems, then that can be really, really tricky. That actually is more a risk now that when more institutions come into the market, actually in the Bitcoin community, I don't know if you guys have heard that SoftBank, who's a great backer of ours, and Cantor and Tether are setting up a $3 billion Bitcoin fund. I think it was announced 1 or 2 days ago. And actually, interestingly enough, in the Bitcoin industry, stuff like that concerns people because they're like, hey, they're going to centralize. The more larger institutions own more and more of the stack. MicroStrategy is another good example. I think they own we're like at 10% or something, like a significant amount of Bitcoin, where that becomes a possible attack vector to the network, right? And so the open source cryptographically secured networks basically function via the tokenomics, and there is always the short-term risk to what happens to these tokens, and what does that do to the long-term viability of these networks. And so what we need is regulation so that people in the US can legally do this, run infrastructure, run nodes here in the US so they don't go offshore. That's one starting point. So we need to even start with bringing the infrastructure back to the US. And so that was a big flight the last couple of years, even in our business. Most people who asked us to run infrastructure or nodes wanted it to be done outside of the US. And so you want to make sure that that comes back in here. And then you still need to deal with, how open are these networks? And you'll see that most banks and financial institutions are actually thinking of building their own blockchains at this point. And so we call it on L2s, for example. Some companies are public about it, like JP Morgan. And so we'll see how that goes with permissioned and public networks and stuff. But
how confident are you about regulation passing in the US?
I mean, listen, I was here all day. I met like the Treasury and Senate people, and I'm just thrilled anyone wants to even meet me. The last 4 years, I wouldn't even have gone to Washington out of fear of, being put in the back of a van or something. And so I feel very, very good. I think more than anything, we need to start with just having rules. I don't even care if they're bad rules, but they just need to be applied consistently. And so I think the first batch of rules is going to be good enough. It's really hard to regulate crypto, and so we're going to need a couple of iterations, but I'm very positive.
Chris, is there a role in regulation in trying to manage just general digital security risk?
So there's a lot of regulation out there already today as it relates to cyber. And some of it is industry self-regulating. Some of it is government regulations. It varies wildly by country. And I think also there's the element of whether it's a security regulation or a privacy regulation. That's another area where we've seen a lot of explosive growth. So I think from a cybersecurity perspective, I think the industry has got a fairly good level of rigor. And I think a lot of organizations also are driven to want to do the right thing, partially also because it's more than just the regulatory impacts. It is the reputation, the impact to the operations of their organization. We find it for many entities, it's not just the fear of if we're not compliant with the regulation, but it's this malware, this threat actor can shut down our operations and we can no longer operate. I've seen that many, in the manufacturing, for example, industry where they get hit with a ransomware attack and they file for bankruptcy. They're not able to continue. So you could potentially apply regulations to it, but in some of these cases, they're looking at it from a business continuity and a resiliency standpoint, probably even before they're looking at it from a regulatory standpoint.
Do you find that end customers care or are aware of what the level of security that of the vendors that they're going to, or the companies they're going to? Do they? I know they sort of think about it. Do they actually make consumer decisions based on this company's safer rather than that company?
So I would say yes, and personally we see it. We have a lot of organizations that reach out to us to do things like vendor risk assessments, cyber risk quantification, where they actually want to measure the risk of working with a particular party. And then also what they will typically do is do that on an ongoing basis. So it's not just a matter of, I contract with you and I feel you're a safe, partner to work with today, but that is something that I then repeatedly refresh over time to make sure that you don't just do something in order to get the contract and later on you stop doing all those security controls. So we are seeing it now. I will say that the fact that we saw third-party risk increase that much tells us there's obviously a lot more room for improvement. But I think the fact that organizations do that is a good sign that they recognize there's a need, and obviously there's more that organizations need to do to lean in.
Konstantin, do you think end customers, people who buy crypto, are they really rigorously looking at the people they invest with?
No, I mean, I think what happens is crypto is so because it's pure money, right? It's so greed driven, and so I think when people see a yield and an opportunity for upside, a lot of the logic thinking leaves the table, and we've seen that. Even if you look back to FTX on very basic premises, like the companies have boards and stuff, which seems to be very obvious governance questions that obviously people like to not ask if they can, you don't want to look a gifted horse in the mouth, I think. So if it goes well, then you're kind of incentivized to not probe too much. I think one of the things we've seen, and we're one of the few idiots really who never left the US. We're one of maybe there's 20 significant crypto companies that are domiciled in the US that actually are still around from 2020, 2021. And it came at a huge cost, but we do it because we think that in the future, it's very important for entities to work with vendors for technology that are domiciled in the US, that have actually audited financials, that apply to normal compliance and security and technology standards. But it's interesting to me that a lot of procurement processes don't look at those type of structures of who are the investors, who is the cap table, who actually controls the company via the different shareholder classes and things. It gets complicated in crypto, specifically in DeFi. When you talk about a DAO, for example, then it's how do you really evaluate who owns it and who controls it? And so it really requires a new rule set, right? And so ultimately, we're just scratching the surface of what that looks like. But we're advocating very strongly for people to look really closely who are their technical vendors, specifically in crypto. Yeah.
So we're running really long, short on time. So just one really quick question, because it feels like we are moving into a world where we all need to think much more clearly about digital security and not sort of take things for granted. You had a great anecdote backstage about a flip phone.
Oh,
just share that.
Yeah, well, I think the pinnacle for security for us is flip phones these days for two-factor authentication, for example. So devices that are totally air-gapped from the internet. So anything that sort of touches the internet basically exposes a risk factor. And so for a lot of the wallet activity we do, we basically, it's basically you're back to pen and paper and flip phones.
Okay, so all of you go out and buy a flip phone.
From Verizon.
Yes, from Verizon.
I'll be there.
There you go.
Be there.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.